Good afternoon and welcome to the Inside Story. Today I am joined by Simon Laffin, who is the author of Behind Closed Doors and a portfolio director. So, hi Simon, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. So, book's coming out very soon. So I thought we'd have a chat about it and find out a little bit more. But before we do that, tell us about you and what it means to be a non-exec director.
So, in my executive career, I worked for Safeway, and I was the CFO and property director. And then when we sold the business to Morrison's, I went into private equity, and I worked private equity for 10 years, but then developed a portfolio career as a non-exec director, and I've also been chairman of a few companies. So I've sort of seen different parts of corporate life as an executive, as a non-executive, as a chairman, and indeed as private equity.
Crikey, that all sounds very, very complicated. So for somebody like me who knows nothing about the world of execs and non-execs and CEOs, what does it all mean? In fact, let's sort of go from the book itself. How do you open the door to it to actually explain what it is for somebody like myself?
Well, you need to think about a board. A board consists of executives and non-executives. So executives are people like the finance director or the chief executive who work in those businesses full time. And then a board has non-executives, people who may have several jobs, whose role on the board is to turn up to meetings, to offer guidance and counselling, and take some decisions as part of the board. So the board's an interesting mix of people who are full-time and then some people who are part-time. And the thing about, what I felt really strongly about boards is you don't get much training to be a board director. You can imagine if you go through an executive career, there are development programs, you get some coaching and mentoring, and that seems straightforward. But actually, to serve on a board, and particularly to be a non-exec, there isn't a strict career path. There aren't clear ways of training, and a lot of the development courses and programs there are legalistic. They're about corporate governance, and gosh, they are so dull. And yet they tell you, this is the company law. They don't tell you what to do at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning when you're on a board. And I'm attempting to answer that question, not go into the governance and the law and all of that.
So, do you have to be a certain kind of person to become a non-exec? Yeah, can anybody do it?
Anybody could do it who can handle. You've got to have a certain degree of ability to understand numbers and a certain degree to understand business. So, you have to have a certain level of understanding and ability to be a board director. The big question, the really interesting question is, how much experience do you need? So, for example, if you're going to be an executive director, the experience you need will be fairly set out, right? A professional expertise in finance or maybe in production or marketing, etc. But to be a non-exec, the requirements are much more open. And they have to be even more open these days, because if you say we only want non-execs who've gone through a business career, you will end up predominantly with men, white men, and men in their 50s and 60s. And that's what traditionally we have got. But now we understand that we need boards to perform better, and they perform better with diverse people. We need people from ethnic minority backgrounds. We need more females. And one of the ways that you can do that is by being more open in experience and saying, yes, particular business experience is really important, but other forms of life experience are also valuable. And I think nomination committees now are realizing they need to be a bit more open-minded in terms of the experience that they get, particularly from underrepresented groups.
You touched on that quite a lot in the book, but it's, I mean, it's very difficult, I think, probably for a lot of people that, like I said, don't really know the world very well, to think, yes, I can do that, and there's a straightforward way for me to actually make that happen. And I think hopefully that the book here will kind of give a bit more of an understanding of what it is that you need to have and know before you can sort of go, all right, yeah, actually, I know I'm getting to go, probably getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. The book, I mean, you made me laugh the other day when you said that the book wasn't just aimed at people that wanted to get into the boardroom, but actually people that are already in there and bluffing their way through it. So who would you suggest then is your ideal reader of the book?
I think the book should appeal to lots of different groups. Yes, you're right. For somebody who wants to become a board director, but doesn't really know what boards do, doesn't really understand what happens inside boards, maybe not even clear how they can get to be a director, then the book it is absolutely the best thing for them to look at. So it will take them through talking to headhunters, applying for jobs, looking which company you'd want to join. And then when you're in the board, how to act. And then in different scenarios, what the sort of questions you should ask and what you should look out for. But I think it's not just aspiring directors. I think it'll appeal to a lot of existing directors, because not all directors have all of the sort of experience that we talk about it in the book. So, for example, I think that a better understanding of risk in taking business decisions is really important. Now, that, a lot of directors won't have had specific training in how to think about risk and how to evaluate decisions. So for them, there's lots of information, there's lots of anecdotes and tips on them in how to factor risk into decision making. Or, a director may have never served on a remuneration committee, and there's lots of information there about what remuneration committees look for, the sort of things to watch out for. So I think it's attempted to be a fairly comprehensive review on what boards do. And I think it'll pick up lots of different experiences and situations that a lot of directors won't have come across so far in their career. And it'll prepare them for the time they do come across those situations.
I must admit, I was very surprised. And I think I said to you at the beginning, because it isn't my world, I thought I would struggle with going through it and understanding what you were talking about, really. I figured it was kind of do a little bit of that to me, but actually it's written in such a way that once I sort of got into it, it became really quite interesting. So even though it's not something that I'm planning on doing, I found a lot of it really quite fascinating. Certainly the interactions and the way you almost have to kind of position people, and perhaps a little bit of knowledge of politics and how to handle people as well. And that bit for me was really quite interesting. And some of the things that you say in how to how non-execs and execs kind of don't always get on and things like that. So to me, that they were the really interesting bit. And I was surprised at just how easy a read it really was. And I don't mean that in any kind of derogatory way. I was expecting it to be a lot more heavy and a lot more dry, and it's not. I think the anecdotes in there and the way it's written make it a very, very easy read. But for you, you've touched on risk and things like, why do you think it's important, certainly at the moment, for people to be reading the book? What's sort of happening in the world of boards that make the books particularly stand out right now?
Well, there's a few things that are really changing what it's like to be on a board. First of all, social media. I mean, the effect of social media on boards and senior decision-making companies you cannot underestimate how much a difference it's making. And one of the examples I give in the book is when I was chairman of Flybe, and we had an aircraft land coming into Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. And as it landed, one of the undercarriage legs gave way, and the aircraft gradually and somewhat ungainlily collapsed onto the runway. Now, nobody was hurt, and it was obviously a serious incident. But the first that I knew as chairman was that somebody phoned me up and said, Simon, we've had an incident at Schiphol. The best way to find out is to look on YouTube and Twitter, because people had posted film of the actual undercarriage collapse on social media before they'd even got back into the terminal building. And that's a measure that you can imagine if you're in a boardroom and before your own information systems will alert you, the entire world knows, because not only is it on Twitter, but a film of it is on Twitter. And this, I'm afraid, is increasingly common because everybody's got camera phones and everybody's able to post. So the speed with which boards have got to react now is almost literally at light speed. Just, in the old days, you might have worried about what newspaper would print tomorrow morning. Yeah. Tomorrow morning's an age. So I think boards are very, very visible. You've got to take decisions quickly. You've got to be prepared for those sort of decisions. And then you've got things like social media will judge you, because they will judge whether you've handled an incident well or badly within something like an hour of it ever happening. Now, lots of boards will have had contingency planning for events, and it'll take several hours. You just haven't got that anymore. So boards have got to be very agile, and they've got to be very open to the outside world, because that scrutiny. If you take, for example, a remuneration issue, if somebody thinks somebody's been paid too much or paid off, etc., that will be on Twitter and social media within minutes of it first coming out. And you haven't got time to sit down with your PR team and work, how would we respond to that? You have to have done it in advance. If you haven't done it in advance, you know where. Yeah. So boards need more openness. They need to be faster to react. And then on the other side, there's a lot of pressure from the media and from the government and regulators on companies over a number of high-profile business failures, things like Carillion, for example, or the Philip Green empire. And there's a strong view that regulation has failed, and therefore we need more regulation. Yeah. And I say in the book, it's the old lie. The old lie is that the answer to bad regulation is more regulation. No. The answer to bad regulation is good regulation. And there's a white paper out on audit and governance, and the consultation just finished at the beginning of July, and we'll probably hear this late autumn the government's response. But there are like 100 different initiatives, and a lot of them look more like punishing business than trying to solve a problem. And I talk in my book that regulation must be appropriate and it must be evidence-based. And if you look at 100-odd proposals, there's almost, in the white paper, there's almost no evidence to back any of them. And there is certainly no intent by the government so far to say, this is a good idea, should we trial it? I mean, you're in business, I'm in business. If you have a good idea, you think, well, let's trial it. And if it works on a trial, we'll roll it out. No. In government terms, we're going to dictate it for everybody. We could be insisting every public interest entity has dual audits or joint audits with no evidence it'll be any success, no check that it'll work, and no real understanding of the implications. So the book argues that what we need, Taryn, is we need education, not regulation.
Yeah.
We need to encourage directors to learn, let's face it, learn from other mistakes, learn from failures. I spent my career learning from errors I've made or things I've seen that have gone wrong. And if you don't learn, you're not going to get better. But the answer isn't yet more regulation, more pages to the annual report, more declarations than your annual report. The answer is better educated directors.
So leading on from that kind of moves into bringing new blood into the boards as well, which I think is kind of the other point you were raising, that if you've got boards made up of everybody who's the same, so you know you're to coin your phrase, the pale, male and stale boards, then you're not going to have that kind of input of new ideas and being open to changes and education. Whereas, you know, if you've got a lot more diversity in there, you've got people from completely different backgrounds that you know haven't become indoctrinated by the regulations that have always been, or the whole sort of, well, we've always done it this way attitude, then maybe there's a chance for it to change and develop in a better way. Is that kind of the thought process?
Yeah, it is. It's a difficult balance, right? It is not straightforward. You can't just say, let's round up people from the local community and make them board directors, right? For a start, if you're a board director, in certain cases, there's unlimited personal liability. When I joined the board of Northern Rock, I realized that we had 100 billion of assets and a similar amount of liabilities. And in certain circumstances, that could be unlimited personal liability. It could wipe every director out. So yeah, you have to be careful. So, and you know, they're running or leading a company is a skill, and it's a learn skill, right? But it's something you have got to work at. It's not just something you can do with no experience and no understanding at all. It's a bit like saying, let's have a team of surgeons for my operation this afternoon, but I want diverse people in there. And you'd say, well, no, actually, I really, really want people who really know what they're doing, right? So it is tricky. But you can't have just anybody. You need people with ability, the right level of ability and understanding. However, we do have to do, because there's a relatively smaller number of women and people from diverse ethnic backgrounds who have got the sort of traditional experience that goes into the boardroom. To get the value of those people, we need to broaden the experience a bit. So I think it's about broadening that experience. So, for example, taking somebody with some experience, but not as much as you would like, but you say, well, that some experience is offset because they bring a diversity of view. Now, what I think is very important is that people who have some relevant experience, right, which could be, as a customer of a company, it could be running their own company as an entrepreneur. So people with some relevant experience, but they just don't know what boards of companies are like, maybe because they've been an entrepreneur on their own, or maybe because they haven't been working for a company. Reading my book will give them a lot of the learned experience that they need. So when they get an interview, or it'll tell them how to go about trying to get an interview. And when they get an interview, they will be able to discuss many of the board issues, even though they've not experienced them, but because they've read a book that gives them a lot of the background, explains what happens, explains a lot of the terminology, tells them what to watch out for. So I think, for somebody with less experience than they'd want going in for an interview, my advice would be to put the book in their back pocket, right? And to be able to draw on it.
So in your opinion, what makes a really good non-exec?
Ah, that's a good question, isn't it? What makes a good... There's not an identikit picture, right? And one of the interesting things about non-execs is that they can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, because they play different roles on companies. There's obviously the person who chairs the remuneration committee, who you would expect to have an interest in people. You'd expect them to have some sort of knowledge of human resources or maybe remuneration. The audit committee, you're going to probably want somebody who's, if not a qualified accountant, has worked in finance quite a bit. But then you've got normally space on the board for other people who might be experts in consumer goods. They might understand the media. They might understand international operations. They might understand change management. So there are lots of different things. But if I had to pick out the one thing that I wish every non-exec had, would be challenge. Because the non-execs, the finest weapon that a non-exec should have in their back pocket are questions. You ask questions, because you don't go into a board and tell the chief executive how to run the company. That's not your job. You go into that board and you ask the chief executive, have you thought of this? Have you considered the impact on that? Does this really accord with our cultural values? Are you sure that this really is the right thing for us? Do you think that's maybe a bit risky? How does that fit in with this? I don't quite understand this. Explain this and this. That is a good non-exec. And a bad non-exec listens to a situation and thinks, I don't think I really understand this. Oh God, I think I'll keep quiet.
Right.
And that's when I think a lot of our problems in business happen, is when the independent peoples, whose, if you like, their only job is to ask questions, don't ask them. Right? So I think it's about independence. It's about challenging. It's about making yourself difficult, because it's a lot easier, isn't it, Taryn? A lot easier to go into a board meeting and say, yes, that's a good idea. Yes, that's a good idea. Yes, or just say nothing. It's a lot harder to go in and say, are you really sure you want to do that?
So I can see why there would be a kind of clash between the execs and the non-execs. Particularly if, like you say, that they're then going, are you sure that's a good idea? In the book, you actually say that there are ways of handling those sort of situations so that it doesn't kind of cause a big contention, and you've got several egos bashing against each other. So one of the things that interested me was that you suggested having those conversations outside the boardroom as opposed to inside, and putting people on the spot.
Yeah, there's a tendency of regulators and commentators to think that boards work by board meetings. And actually, the really hard work of a board is done outside of a board meeting, a formal board meeting. I mean, occasionally you'll have a board meeting where there's a very vigorous discussion and a big conclusion is made based on that discussion. But even then, you have to set the discussion up. And you set the discussion up by producing the paperwork well in advance so people can read about the issue and get their minds around it. But it also gives an opportunity for people, particularly the non-executive directors, to ask questions and to get clarifications and make sure that they understand and say, well, if you can raise a difficult question, for example, if you give the executives a couple of days' notice by asking it before the board meeting, even if you then ask it in the board meeting, the executives are relaxed because they know you're going to ask it and they've got the answer. You haven't ambushed them. You've given them notice, right? And that's why I think that the best performing boards have that sort of a slight merry-go-round of conversations before the board meeting, so that by the time of the board meeting, people know each other's positions. They don't necessarily agree, but they know their positions, and they're able to have a conversation based on a full knowledge. And that's so much better than papers coming out very late, non-execs turning out who've barely read the papers 10 minutes before the meeting, asking lots of difficult questions, management getting across because they ask these questions and not being able to provide the answer. And you get a lot of heat and no light. So that's why I think the best performing boards do most of their work outside the boardroom.
So, I mean, what happens when you get that kind of huge clash? Is there a point where something's got to give, or do they just keep butting heads? I mean, what happens when you've got that kind of situation?
Well, generally with boards, you find a way, a compromise is reached, because if you've got people all pulling in the same direction and understand common interest, then generally, with a sufficient information, sensible people will come to a similar conclusion. So the answer is, you really want to work to a situation where there's a consensus. Now, occasionally you will get one or two people who disagree with a decision. Now, occasionally that disagreement will be so big that somebody feels they have to resign from the board, and that's the ultimate for any non-exec. But it's fairly rare. Generally, with enough discussion, people could come around to a common understanding of a problem.
Can I just interject? If you can hear a bashing, the dog is outside hitting the door to try and come in. So apologies for any sort of background noise of what sounds like. He's laid down, that's all right.
The dog's behind closed doors, is he?
Yeah, he's definitely behind closed doors. He wants in. Good move there. Well done. So, all right. So, what prompted you to write the book then? Why you?
Well, I've run a blog for a number of years talking about specific instances of how decisions are taken or situations I've been in. And I think I've had a pretty colourful career and seen lots of strange situations. And I really felt, because I believe that getting directors better prepared for situations, more understanding of business situations, is the best protection that shareholders and our society has, and it's more important than more boilerplate regulation. I wanted to do my bit. I wanted to give some of my 30 years of experience to others. And, when you've been through all the sort of situations I've been in, and some of the lessons are so clear that I can put them down in paper. And, for others who come across, for example, imagine, the situation, you're a non-exec and you've been bid for. And when you get bid for, it can happen at almost no notice. Suddenly, you're in a whole new, you may have no understanding what needs to be done. So there's a chapter on the book that tells you pretty much exactly what you should do in that situation. Now, you don't have to do it exactly, but you can then go into that board meeting feeling, yeah, I know the basics here. When I hear them talking about preemption rights, I know what they're going to say, and I know what I should ask about. Otherwise, you let the bankers and the executives, that they can talk away, and you sit there thinking, I've got a clue what's going on. I don't know. Yeah. So that's why I thought this was a good juncture to write the book, and I hope that people will read it and learn from the many situations I've been in.
There's a few in there that when you kind of look at them and you think, some of it almost feels surreal that this kind of behaviour goes on, and sort of certainly big corporate leaders blindly ignoring all the information that they're given and sort of championing through, going, no, it's my way, this is how it's going to work. And I know I read a few of them thinking, how I can see how businesses fail if that's kind of the mindset. So in terms of the difference between the directors and so, or the execs and the non-execs, from a sort of layman's kind of point of view, the non-execs are there more to be a way of policing what's going on inside the business, but they need to care just as much as the directors. Is that kind of a fair assessment?
Non-execs aren't policemen. That's a really, really important point. Non-execs are an independent voice. So if you're an executive team, you're living that business 5, 6, 7 days a week, and you're very, very focused on the projects that you're promoting and things you want to do. The idea of having non-execs is they are people who are independent of the execs and feel a particular responsibility to represent particularly shareholders, but now increasingly other stakeholders. And just to step back a bit and say, are you sure that's a good idea? So I think the best phrase, some companies talk about appropriate risk taking. In other words, the non-exec's job in some ways is to stop the executives taking too big a risk, or maybe not taking any risks at all and being too conservative. So you know that enterprise makes money when it takes a bit of a risk and looks for return on that risk. And to get a balanced view of that, you can't just have the people who do it day in, day out. You need a group of people whose focus is the best interests of the company in the long term, but who aren't wound up in the day-to-day projects of making it happen. So the non-execs are there to provide an independent voice and influence to support management, but to support management in appropriate risk-taking. So it can't be a slavish support, but it's got to be a support of the general intent, with also a bit of challenge. So that's the subtlety of the non-executive role.
So going back then to the white paper, if they suggest more and more regulation, is there a way of pushing back against that, or is it going to be simply a case of you're going to have to swallow it and make the best of it?
Well, I think they've had a very big response to the white paper. The problem is that a lot of the response tends to accept that the government is going to do what the government is going to do, and tends to think that the good news is that it could have been worse. So, for example, there's a lot of people will support it on the basis that it could be worse. It's not the end of the world. This isn't disastrous. What I've not heard is anybody really in business saying, I think these will be fabulous ideas. I think they're all saying we can probably live with it. And then you've got the audit profession, which is under huge pressure. And the auditors are very keen to be seen by the government to be supportive, because they really could have been treated much worse by the white paper. So they're in saying, oh yeah, this is quite a good idea. And things like joint audits, is considerably more work for the audit firms, more things in the annual report, more checks. It's all more work for the audit firms. So some of them, there's a tendency to think audit are business. No, auditors are not business. They're a separate profession. And they, frankly, have an interest in some of the regulation going up. So I think the government will get a wide range of views. I'm pessimistic in the sense that the government will want to implement a lot of these changes, and very few of the changes have got any evidential basis. None of them have been tested or checked, but I suspect some of them will just get rolled out, and business will have to cope with it. And the reality is that boards will spend more and more time worrying about compliance with regulation, and that means they'll spend less time thinking about creating value for stakeholders and ensuring that the business is well run. So I think a lot of it, I'm afraid, I think it'll be counterproductive. But I suspect quite a lot will happen.
So actually, what we're trying to say is get hold of the book, find out everything that you need to know so that when it does all kick in, you're prepared and you can actually do the best job that you can. And please don't worry about it and more people become non-execs and don't worry about the extra regulation. That's what we're trying to say, isn't it?
Well, my message would be, we've got to live with the regulation we've got to live, because that's the politicians will decide it. The best way to create value for shareholders and other stakeholders and to run businesses well is to have high-performing boards. To get high-performing boards, we need well-informed, educated, experienced directors. Reading the book will help you become that.
Brilliant. Well, on that note, thank you very much. The book, so behind closed doors, the boardroom, how to get in, get on and make a difference. So that's out on the 2nd of September and it is available to pre-order now from all good bookstores and online. So Simon, thank you so much for joining me today and speak to you soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.